This is the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. To mark the 50th anniversary of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of A Clockwork Orange, we're examining Burgess's relationship with the director. In part 4 of our series, we speak to David Mikics, a more distinguished professor in the English department of the University of Houston. David has recently published his book Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker, which draws on interviews and new archival research to explore the personal side of Kubrick's films. David has also written books on subjects as wide as Saul Bellow, Jacques Derrida, and the art of the sonnet. He's also edited the annotated Emerson. In 2017, he was awarded a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and he is a regular columnist for Tablet magazine, in which he writes about Jewish culture, history, and politics. Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker, is published by Yale University Press and out now. For more information, head to the link in the description of this episode. Here's Andrew Biswell of the Burgess Foundation, who spoke to David Mikics in November 2021.
Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome David Mikics to the Burgess Foundation podcast. David's the author of Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker, published by Yale University Press, among many other distinguished books. David, welcome. Now,
thank you, Andrew. A great pleasure to be here.
A pleasure to have you. Burgess is one of many writers who worked with Kubrick or whose work was adapted by him. And maybe we could begin with quite a broad question about what kind of relationship do you think Kubrick wanted with his writers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great question. Kubrick, from the beginning, I think had an idea of himself as a screenwriter. He wrote film treatments during his second marriage in the late 1950s, a very troubled marriage to the ballet dancer Ruth Sabatka, and some of those treatments really do, show a kind of Dostoevskian tinge to his dramatic talent, and he wrote full-fledged scripts as well during that period. But he in the films that he actually made, all are co-written by others, and some of the more familiar examples are Paths of Glory, right? In which he worked with Calder Willingham and Jim Thompson. There are cases in which, for example, in Dr. Strangelove, he worked with Terry Southern, and Terry Southern tells a great story about how Kubrick would pick him up at, I think, 5:00 in the morning, and they would have a writing desk in the back of the car, so they'd sit there and write together on that desk, and as they would go into the studio early in the morning, and each day they would rewrite. So it was a very involved relationship that he had with his script writers. Another example is Diane Johnson, with whom he wrote The Shining, and they really puzzled it out together. Stanley wrote a lot of the part of Jack Torrance, who goes mad in the Overlook Hotel, and he and Johnson talked a lot about ideas of horror, about Freud and Bruno Bettelheim and the uncanny and so on. So these were very active relationships. The relationship with Burgess was a bit different. First of all, because Burgess did not write the screenplay for A Clockwork Orange. Kubrick wrote it himself, and it was in fact the first screenplay that he had written solely by himself in his movie career. It's also unique because Burgess, years earlier, in the 60s, the novel of Clockwork Orange came out in May 1962. A little bit after that, Burgess, who was hard up for money, sold the screen rights to Cy Litvinoff and Max Raab. The clothier was also also interested in movies, and he sold it for only a couple of $100. So when Clockwork Orange finally hit the screens in December of 1971, about 50 years ago, people would stop people would stop Anthony Burgess on the street and say, Clockwork Orange is at top of the charts. It's such a big hit. Congratulations. And he would say, yeah, I sold the book rights for a couple $100. So because of that, he did not see profits from the movie until 1973, when he filed suit not against Kubrick but against Litvinov and Rob, and he did win a percentage of the royalties from the film after that.
We're very grateful, in fact, because some of that money is still funding the work of the Burgess Foundation to this day.
Wonderful.
Now, you draw a very interesting comparison between Lolita and A Clockwork Orange when you say that both of these stories are first-person confessions written by very seductive criminals. And I thought that was interesting in itself. But why do you think Kubrick was attracted to these stories?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Andrew. That's fascinating because Kubrick himself was ultra cautious, not ultra violent, but ultra cautious, and frequently described himself as a coward. Although he was fascinated with war, and he made several of his greatest movies about war, he himself avoided occasions of physical risk or physical courage. And so I think part of it is just the attraction to an opposite that really brings out some of the kind of primal energy of cinema. Why do we go to the movies? It's to be stirred up, to be set in motion by this spectacle that brings out impulses in ourselves that we usually wouldn't acknowledge. So you can see that certainly with Lolita, which is about a taboo subject. You have the child rapist, Humbert Humbert, so sophisticated, so dry, so witty, and of course, Clockwork Orange is also about a rapist, Alex DeLarge. So in both these cases, Kubrick is examining something for which we have mixed feelings. We're simultaneously drawn in by the charm or the seductiveness or the wit, the wicked wit of these characters. That's certainly true of both Humbert and Alex, that they're remarkably witty and charming. And yet we're also repelled. And of course, that's more true in the case of Alex, that we're repelled, than in the case of Humbert in the movie. Kubrick left out some of Nabokov's quite clear signposts instructing us that we ought to be suspicious of Humbert, that we ought to think of him as a monster, which is indeed the way Nabokov thought of him. But Kubrick's Humbert does not appear to be a monster. He's a sympathetic fellow for the most part, even as we do sympathize as well with Lolita, so wonderfully played by Sue Lyon. So I would say that in one way of putting it is that with Clockwork Orange, Kubrick does what he did not do or did not want to do in Lolita. That is, he gives us a hero villain by whom we're turned on or thrilled, and but also somebody by whom we're disgusted.
I wanted to ask you as well about juvenile delinquency. You say in your book that A Clockwork Orange shows a whole new way of representing that, quite unlike the films that had gone before it. And can you tell us what's different about A Clockwork Orange compared with, say, Rebel Without a Cause or West Side Story?
hmm yes, I do think that A Clockwork Orange fits into this genre of the juvenile delinquent movie. It also fits into the genre of the musical, uh, so we could talk about that too. But first of all, the juvenile delinquent movie, if you think of a film like The Wild One, famous movie with Marlon Brando, or Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean, these characters were very soulful and sort of, smoldering, inward, oppressed by the sense of the world, and they seem to be oppressed by life itself or the world itself. And I think of that moment in Rebel Without a Cause where James Dean says to his well-meaning father and mother, "You're tearing me apart." It's like in their very urge to, their very bourgeois normalcy is some sort of, drives him to desperation. And there's a sense in those movies, well, especially in Rebel Without a Cause, of the kids as being these outsiders, these sort of fragile outsiders. Natalie Wood and James Dean and Sal Mineo in that film. So none of this is the case in A Clockwork Orange, which is, to name another genre, it's a sort of gangster film, but it is an example, I think, of the juvenile delinquent film, simply because Alex, who is supposed to be a teenager, of course. Malcolm McDowell was 28 when he played Alex, but in the book and ostensibly in the film, he's much younger, and there's a great deal of attention paid to his home situation. Right, you remember the doctor from not doctor, the guy from social services who comes to meet him, to evaluate his home life. How are things going along with you, Alex? Um, it intersects with those juvenile delinquent movies because there is a sense of perplexity or puzzle about, why is this kid a bad seed? What makes him evil, or what makes him at least bad? Evil is not the right word, perhaps, for the juvenile delinquent genre as a whole. So, in A Clockwork Orange, there's a very definite answer supplied by Alex himself, which is badness is of the self. Badness is of the self. This is a quotation from Burgess's novel, but it applies to the movie. And it's something that Kubrick too believes, that there's an element of wickedness within us, that inevitably comes out.
Hmm. And what about A Clockwork Orange as a musical? I mean, we know that Burgess later, after the film was out, he adapted it as a stage musical. But many of those elements are, of course, there in the novel and kind of intensified in the movie, in the sense that Kubrick brings various musical elements which are not in the book, such as Rossini and Elgar and so forth. And I'd always assumed this is a kind of soundtrack playing in Alex's head through the film. So I guess that makes it a different kind of musical from West Side Story. I mean, there's no singing, right?
Right. Yeah, well, there is, of course, one
Mhm.
instance of singing, which is the most famous number in the film, that is "Singing in the Rain." And, McDowell told this story several times to several different interviewers. So I'll give you the sort of bare bones of it, that they were sitting around on the set for 3 days trying to figure out the scene, in this terrifying scene in which Adrian Corey is raped by the Droogs, by Alex and his thugs, and she's the wife of the writer, Mr. Alexander, and he's made to witness the rape. So it's a scene that's somehow, as one critic says, it's somehow ridiculous as well as strangely exciting and also repellent all at once. It's a quite horrifying scene, but part of what makes the scene is the fact that Malcolm McDowell is singing and dancing to "Singing in the Rain," doing this soft shoe number. So they were sitting around the set for 3 days, according to McDowell, and then Kubrick finally trying to figure out the scene, and then Kubrick finally said, "Malk, do you?" Can you sing? That's one version, or another was like, Mal, can you sing and dance? And McDowell said, well, I know one song, "Singing in the Rain." And so that's the song he chose. It was Malcolm McDowell's song. And I think part of the brilliance, the kind of awful brilliance of the scene, is the way in which um, what you see in Alex in that scene is not the kind of high polished cruelty of some film noir villain, or some gangster. But what you see is really the kind of satisfaction of, an 11 or 12-year-old boy as he's, going through this comic song and dance, and which will finally lead to the brutal attack on Adrian Corey, which apparently, Kubrick filmed this over and over, and Kubrick had, as he sometimes did, he was fond of repeated takes, and it was very hard on all of them, but especially Adrian Corey, who bears the brunt of Alex's blows. So there's that scene, and then near the beginning of the movie, we have that kind of that it's a sort of Wild West ballet between. In fact, this was staged in a theater. I forget the name of the theater now, but it was a theater that was used by Chaplin and Fred Carno. So it's an old sort of vaudeville house. So we have this vast stage, and there's a group of rival thugs led by Billy Boy, and they're assaulting this girl. So when Alex and his droogs appear, they drop the girl. She runs away, and the two gangs fight. And you see them sort of flipping each other through the air, sort of in a very ballet-like fashion, to the accompaniment of Rossini's Thieving Magpie Overture, which seems like it's a perfect musical choice. So we have that, and there are other scenes as well in which you can think of this as a kind of musical. The comic scene, the speeded up orgy with the two teenage girls. We see Alex with Wendy Carlos's synthesized version of the William Tell Overture. That was that sequence posed a problem for the rating of the movie, as I'll talk about later. But yeah, so there's a lot of these. It seems to be organized in the ending too, with the ode to joy, and of course Hollywood musicals are odes to joy. So we see this at the very end, much to our disquiet, but also a kind of strange joy as Alex, rises up from his hospital bed, and he has the fantasy of having sex with a naked woman, and there are all these sort of gents and ladies in Edwardian garb surrounding him, applauding. So that fantasy at the end of the movie is like sort of, it's a big feel-good number. It's the resurrection of a maimed villain, as somebody, as another critic, James Nairmore, pointed out, and similar in that respect to the end of Dr. Strangelove, which is also a musical number. So yeah, these are all connections between A Clockwork Orange and the musical.
It's very interesting about the Charlie Chaplin connection as well, given that the presence of the bowler hats, which are not in the novel. Also because Burgess's father, who played piano in the music halls, claimed to have worked with the brothers Sid and Charlie Chaplin when they were starting out, long before Charlie made it to Hollywood. Still, you say as well that the effect of A Clockwork Orange is to make the audience guilty about enjoying violence. I thought that was a really bold proposition, and one that I wanted to stop and think about. How do you think the film achieves that?
Well, in part, I've already alluded to it, that on every instance of violence depicted in the movie, I think provokes mixed feelings in the spectator. Although it should be remembered that when Burgess saw the movie once, he saw it several times. Of course, he saw it in a preview. He and his wife and 7-year-old son were flown to London and put up so that he could see the film in the fall of '71 before it was released. But he then later saw it in a movie theater in New York, and I remember that in his memoir, Burgess says, he was horrified because the audience took this as, they took it as a straight celebration of violence, and they were, sort of standing up and punching their fists in the air. But certainly, that's not the way Kubrick intended it. It was not a glorification of the thug. It was not, an ode to violence. But it was meant to make us queasy. because every moment where we might celebrate Alex's prowess and his finesse in executing violence, we also find him repellent, I believe. His most attractive moment, perhaps, in terms of an act of violence, is that great scene at the marina, where in slow motion you see Alex rise up. He said, "I was struck by inspiration, uh, and he slashes Dim, his fellow Droog, in the hand with his knife." And this is during the sort of the abortive rebellion of the Droogs against Alex, and this is how he quashes it. So we see them subdued, all sitting around in the next scene, subdued to Alex. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is in that the rape scene, the rape of Mrs. Alexander, or the assault on the cat lady, played by Miriam Carlin, with that penis sculpture. And in those cases, I think we're very we're very disquieted. Think about that scene with the penis sculpture, a very important work of art, as the cat lady tells Alex, and he proceeds to grab it and to kill her with it. He smashes it into her face, and at that moment, when he smashes the sculpture into her face, we have a sort of several jump cuts of these cartoon images of mouths. That's a form of distancing as well. I mean, obviously, we don't see her actually being killed, but it's also a form of, it reminds us exactly how disruptive, disturbing, irrational, inhuman Alex is being at this moment. So in that case, and in the rape scene of Mrs. Alexander, we do not exult in Alex's violence.
Thinking back 50 years to the critical response to A Clockwork Orange, um, I mean, it seems to me, reading about it and reading what the studio was saying to Burgess about it was quite unexpected. It was almost unprecedented. Though in some cases, as you've shown, the critics were very negative about the film. Do you think, as far as we can reconstruct it, Kubrick was surprised by what critics and reviewers had to say about it?
Well, I don't know about surprise, but he was surely displeased by Pauline Kael's reaction, because Kael said that Kubrick was, and I'm quoting, "sucking up to the thugs in the audience." And, this, of course, as I've just explained, was not his intention at all. Um, there were appreciative reviews, especially outside of New York. Um, Andrew Saris, who had disliked 2001, had panned 2001, and then went back to it under the influence of a smoked substance, as he said, and revised his opinion somewhat of 2001 and thought, oh, it really is a pretty good movie. Saris said, "I'm not going to change my mind on this one. This is, no one will sit through this, A Clockwork Orange. It's just too boring." So this proved, of course, to be not at all the case. But the opinions of the New York critics were frequently quite negative about Kubrick's movies, including Doctor Strangelove, 2001, and also Clockwork Orange. But I think what Kubrick was surprised by and frightened by was the way in which the movie became so famous, such a phenomenon. Part of the clues to the way that happened was not just the kind of shocking, iconoclastic nature of the violence in the movie, but also the incredible style. The way a whole world is invented. We're turning we're crossing the street now from the end of the 70s, the era of glam, the era of sort of gender tweaking rock and roll style. We're going into something new, something much more sort of quasi-military, with the paratrooper boots and the cod pieces, the bloody eyeball armbands, and the bowler hats, as you mentioned. So this was a remarkable invention on the level of style. Um, but yes, Kubrick was frightened by, well, for one thing, the number of death threats that he and his family received, and this is what caused him to take the film out of UK circulation in 1973.
You also say that A Clockwork Orange, the movie, is completely at odds with those 1960s dreams of peace and love, and anticipating punk in the ways that you've described. It seemed to me that maybe that's part of its importance, is that as the movie that comes after 2001, perhaps it's challenging a whole set of things and assumptions and values which had been quite current up until that point. And then as you get into the 70s, there's this break, this sort of fissure, and now we're looking at something else, a different vision of what people are like, perhaps.
hmm Yeah, you can talk about it, and I think that's quite true, Andrew. That it's a, it's a watershed. This is a real zeitgeist movie. It's like Altamont, the famous festival at which the Rolling Stones play using the Hells Angels as their bodyguards, and things turn very bad. Someone is killed by the Angels. So, Altamont as opposed to Woodstock with its dreams of peace and love. So, yes, for all of there is, of course, a dark underside or a sinister element to 2001, but it's also a vision of serenity, harmony, the emptiness, the wideness of the universe, these kind of speculative prospects. Who knows what the future of the human race will be? Whereas in A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick is making a statement that is, as he said, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in which he said, I do not believe in Rousseau. I do not believe that humans are born good. There is evil within us. And Clockwork Orange is digging down into that fact of what Kubrick sees as a fact.
I'd like to widen the focus slightly, if I may, to bring in the Napoleon film, which is the next point of intersection between Kubrick and Burgess. It's just after A Clockwork Orange has been released. Burgess becomes involved in the Napoleon project, which had been around for some years. And we know that he sent the first half of his Napoleon novel, Napoleon Symphony, to Kubrick. And that book is dedicated to Kubrick, partly in the hope that it might be turned into a film. But I wonder what kind of movie about Napoleon Kubrick would have made if he'd found a way to realize it.
That's another very interesting question. I think that Kubrick's one of his basic motivations, one thing he really wanted to do was to make a war movie in which you could really see the the sort of gigantic scale of things. He wanted to lay out for the viewer, well, here is this army in this formation. The opposing army comes up on its flank. So all of this would demand, of course, thousands of extras. And in fact, Kubrick, who did pre-planning for the Napoleon movie that he never got to make, he was setting things up in Romania, and he claimed to have found the requisite number, thousands of extras, and he said he could do it for about $4 million. Clockwork Orange, by the way, cost $2 million. It was a very inexpensive movie. Um, but yeah, so that was a bit of an underestimate. But the real reason I think that the studios were not interested in the Napoleon film, well, there were two reasons. One was an immediate one, that the film Waterloo, Sergei Bondarchuk's Waterloo, had done very badly at the box office, and in general, this fed into a suspicion of historical costume epics at that time in Hollywood. So, the old line from some distributor is, he gets a movie, he gets the film in the can that week, and the exhibitor rather gets the movie in the can, and he says, "Oh no, not another movie where people write with feathers." So that this is long before the age of the historical romance epic, and which of course had done very well in an earlier era of movies, but by this point, the late '60s, it was not a very viable genre. So that was one problem. But what kind of movie would he have made? I've read the Napoleon script, and it's not a bad script. It's a script by Burgess. I'm sorry, not by Burgess. It's a script by Kubrick. He wrote that script by himself, and I think there are certain possibilities there. Napoleon sounds a bit like Kubrick himself. He says things like, the art of war is quite simple. You simply have to figure out everything in advance. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the basic point. He's like this sort of, very logical person who attends to all the details, just as Kubrick did. One of the lines about Kubrick being, well, he wouldn't let so much as a trouser pleat go unsupervised. This was, I think, Michael Hare who said this. I'm not quite sure, but at any rate, yeah, Kubrick was attentive to every detail, and if you do that and think about everything as a chess problem, he was also a famous chess player, Kubrick. Then you win the war. So part of the problem with the Napoleon script is that we never really figure out what leads to Napoleon's downfall, since he's such a sort of seamlessly impressive figure. That's one issue with the script. So he surely would have worked that script over quite substantially had he made the movie. But of course, it was the product of a long time obsession with Napoleon on Kubrick's part. He had read hundreds of books about Napoleon, and he has a series of dialogues which are quite interesting with the Oxford historian Felix Markham, biographer of Napoleon, in which they talk about different aspects of Napoleon and his times. So yeah, I mean, you could say that instead of making Napoleon, he made Barry Lyndon. That was his historical epic.
Now, the next moment where Kubrick and Burgess cross swords or encounter each other is the project which becomes Eyes Wide Shut. It's not quite called that in 1976 when they were talking about it. It's the Schnitzler um, project. And you mentioned in your book that Kubrick was planning Eyes Wide Shut as a kind of sex comedy. And then when he was talking to Burgess about it in 1976, I think he had quite a clear vision of what he wanted it to be, which didn't coincide with Burgess. Burgess says you've got to set it in Schnitzler's own Vienna, or the fin de siècle one, with music from Richard Strauss, the Metamorphosis. And I think probably that's what ends Burgess's involvement, is that his vision is too precise and at variance with what Kubrick wants. But can you tell us a bit about how that project evolved over time? I think he'd been planning it for some years before Frederick Raphael came on the scene.
Hmm. Yes, he had indeed, and it's a bit unclear when Kubrick actually read Schnitzler's novella, which is called Dream Story, or Traumnovelle in German. He may have read it in the late 1950s under the impetus of his wife at that time, Ruth Sobotka, who was a refugee from Vienna, and Ruth knew a lot about the sort of Central European literature and art, and she might have introduced him to it. Kirk Douglas claimed that Douglas's psychoanalyst had had given a copy of the Schnitzler to Kubrick. This is also a great story because Kirk Douglas, when they were filming Spartacus, exactly the same time, I think, when Burgess had that terrible year in which he learned he had a year only to live, 1959, and he wrote, I believe, 5 books that year, including A Clockwork Orange. At that same time, Kubrick had been called in by Kirk Douglas to film Spartacus. Douglas had fired the previous director, Anthony Mann, after a couple of weeks. So Kubrick and Douglas also had their quarrels. And at one point, Douglas said, "Okay, Stanley, in order to really understand me, you'll have to meet my shrink." And so this is how it's quite funny. Yeah, so this is what a Hollywood story, right? So Kubrick did so. So the Schnitzler may have been given to him on that occasion. Um, but at any rate, he was deeply moved by this and deeply affected by it. And I think it had something to do with the nature of, in someone who is completely bourgeois, sort of the ordinary man living a very square life. That is Kubrick himself, right? Who has this kind of adventurous fantasy of transgression and of disloyalty to his wife. So, or trying to be disloyal to his wife. It's sort of like, the film is like Don Giovanni in the sense that, it's hard for us to remember this. Don Giovanni never actually sleeps with a woman in the course of the opera. So similarly, the hero of Dream Story never sleeps with a woman either, except for his wife. But that is the fantasy. That is the fantasy on his part, and it's the fantasy on her part as well. So uh, Kubrick's uh, Kubrick's last wife, Christiane, with whom he stayed for the last 40 years of his life, very happy marriage. She remembers saying to Kubrick in sometime in the 60s, we're still too young. We've just gotten married a few years ago. You can't make this movie. It's too dangerous, too risky. And as he said, he kept with the idea of Schnitzler, and he in various interviews he was very complimentary about Schnitzler, even calling him, the greatest 20th century writer, or at least the writer with the greatest psychological penetration in the 20th century. It's rather an overestimate, I think, but he did like Schnitzler, and it is an interesting book. So one idea in the 70s, as you mentioned, he returned to it, was to do it as a sort of comedy with perhaps Woody Allen or Steve Martin in the role, and that in black and white, he was thinking. That faded away. What you mention as Burgess's idea is, of course, very interesting for the book, as is Frederick Raphael's when he finally does hire Raphael as the screenwriter. Raphael said, I think it should be in a medieval walled city. And Kubrick's response was, we'll set it in New York. So whether he was agreeing with Raphael or not is unclear, right? But the New York of the movie is it's a sort of unreal New York. Of course, famously, it's not filmed on the actual streets of New York. It's all a stage set, and it looks like a stage set. So he did want something. He did want something artificial, I think, as the mise en scène, as the setting for Eyes Wide Shut.
Eyes Wide Shut is another one of those enigmatic masterpieces, perhaps even more mysterious than 2001. Do you think the story does add up to a coherent piece of narrative?
I think it does, but it took me a long time to come to that point. A friend of mine, Bob Kolker, who has written wonderful books about Kubrick, said to me once, uh, why is it that when I was so indifferent to this movie when I first saw it, why is it that I can't stop watching it now? Uh, there was a story, by the way, in during the pandemic, that there was a woman who had watched Eyes Wide Shut hundreds of times. She said during the pandemic. So there is something addictive about the movie, but not at first. I think at first it does seem somewhat disjointed, artificial, certainly, off-putting. One invidious comment was that it was one of the famous cracks about Eyes Wide Shut, about the orgy scene in particular, is whose idea of an orgy is this? The Catholic Church's? I forget who said that, but in other words, it seems like very decadent. You have this sort of very stagey and deliberately artificial presentation. But I think that was Kubrick's intention, as others have pointed out as well. That it was meant to look fake. Anytime you try to realize a fantasy, it's not real at all. There's just a sort of fakeness there. So I think the real heart of the movie is in as I explain in my book, is in the conversations between the husband and the wife, between Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who are actually husband and wife, of course. And the kind of the intimacy, the sort of groundbreaking twists and turns of those conversations are really remarkable. But yes, I do think it hangs together. Um, for all that it's the kind of odyssey of the hero wandering through the night. Uh, to me, it does have a symmetry, and it does have a clear structure.
Now, your Kubrick book is published by Yale University Press in their Jewish Lives series. And it's quite a big question to close with. What do you think Kubrick's Jewish identity meant to him? And how far is that communicated in his films?
Not communicated very much, I would say, in some respects, but he was very conscious of it. Of course, he was quite Jewish, I guess we could say, although he never had a bar mitzvah, apparently from sheer lack of interest. And but he read obsessively about the Holocaust and was planning to make a Holocaust movie from the excellent novel by Louis Begley, The Wartime Lies, which Kubrick was going to film under the title The Aryan Papers. So he never wound up doing that. But there was some respect in which he really identified with Jewish American humor. Certainly, that's you can see a connection to Mad Magazine or to Lenny Bruce in Doctor Strangelove. You can also see, well, I'll just quote the words of Christiane, his widow, who said, we used to tease him and say that he was like Tevye the milkman. You know, he would raise his eyes to the sky accusingly and go, "Oi, ah." So he had a lot of the verbal inflections that one would associate with a Jew from the Bronx, which indeed was what Kubrick was. Um, and yeah, so as with many Jews of his generation, who were not observant in New York City, also he had a great fondness for Christmas. And you see that this comes out in Eyes Wide Shut, which of course is a Christmas movie. There are Christmas trees everywhere.
Well, David, thank you very much for giving us such a fascinating overview of Kubrick. Your book, Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker, I recommend to everyone wholeheartedly. It's a great piece of research and a great piece of writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was a lot of fun.
You've been listening to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker by David Mikics is out now. For more information on Anthony Burgess and to find out how you can support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?